The words hit me like ice water thrown in my face. "You are the worst mistake I've ever made." My father's voice cut through the Christmas carols playing softly in the background, silencing the room like a gunshot. The turkey sat carved and cooling on the good china, the cranberry sauce untouched in my grandmother's crystal bowl. My sister Jessica's fork froze halfway to her mouth, her husband Robert reaching for his wine glass with shaking fingers. My mother's hands went still on the serving spoon, mashed potatoes sliding back into the bowl with a wet plop. And me? I set down my knife, wiped my hands on my napkin with deliberate care, and looked my father directly in the eyes. What I said next wasn't planned. It wasn't rehearsed. But it was something that had been building in my chest for 32 years, waiting for exactly this moment to break free. "The worst mistake you ever made," I repeated slowly, tasting each word like bitter medicine. "That's interesting, Dad. Because sitting here right now, looking at this family, I'm realizing something too." I stood up from the table, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor that I had helped him install 3 summers ago when my back was young and my hope was foolish. The worst mistake I ever made was spending my entire life trying to convince someone to love me who was never capable of it in the first place. The silence that followed was so complete. You could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway counting down the seconds until everything changed forever. My mother's face went white as the tablecloth. Jessica's mouth fell open like she was watching a car accident in slow motion. Robert suddenly found his potatoes very interesting. But my father? My father just stared at me with those cold gray eyes that had measured my worth since childhood and found it wanting, year after year after year. "How dare you?" he started, but I held up my hand. For the first time in my life, I was the one who got to finish. "No, Dad. For once in my life, you're going to listen to me. Really listen. Because in about 2 minutes, I'm walking out of this house and I'm never coming back. So you better pay attention to every single word. Tell me in the comments if you've ever had a moment when you finally stood up to someone who had been tearing you down your whole life. What gave you the courage to finally speak your truth? For me, it was realizing that silence had become more painful than whatever consequences might come from breaking it. I had grown up in Kalamazoo, in one of those neighborhoods where every lawn was precisely edged and every driveway was pressure washed twice a year. My father, William Bennett, owned a chain of auto parts stores across southern Michigan, Bennett's Auto Supply. You probably passed one on your way to work, the red and white sign promising fair prices and honest service. What you wouldn't know from driving past is that the man behind those stores measured everything in life the way he measured bolts and gaskets, with cold precision and zero tolerance for anything that didn't fit exactly where it was supposed to go. My sister Jessica fit. She had always fit. Golden hair, perfect grades, married her high school sweetheart, who now managed the largest store in the chain. She had given him 2 grandsons who played Little League and said, "Yes, sir," and "No, sir," and never tracked mud on his spotless garage floor. Jessica was the daughter he pointed to at church fundraisers and business dinners. She was the one whose picture sat on his desk at the office, the one whose achievements he recited like a prayer of gratitude to whatever God watched over disappointed fathers. And then there was me, Sarah, the daughter who had insisted on studying art instead of business, the daughter who had married a musician instead of an accountant, the daughter who had spent 10 years trying to make it as a freelance graphic designer while living in a converted warehouse downtown, painting murals for coffee shops that paid in espresso and false promises, the daughter who had no children to carry on his precious family name, no husband stable enough to inherit his empire, no accomplishments worthy of his spotless desk. I was 32 years old, finally making decent money designing websites for small businesses, finally in a relationship with someone who saw me as more than a disappointing reflection of his own unrealized dreams. But in my father's eyes, I was still the 8-year-old who had spilled grape juice on his presentation materials, still the teenager who had refused to work summers at the store, still the young woman who had chosen art school over a practical degree in accounting or business management. The irony was that I had been desperate for his approval for most of my adult life. I had tried everything. I had dressed differently for family dinners, talked about my work in terms he might understand, even dated a banker for 6 months because I thought financial stability might finally earn me a seat at his table of acceptable daughters. Nothing worked. He saw through every performance, every carefully curated version of myself I presented. And gradually, over the years, that desperation had hardened into something else. Not quite anger. Not yet. But a cold understanding that some people are simply incapable of seeing past their own narrow definition of success. The Christmas of 2019 was supposed to be different. Marcus and I had just gotten engaged, and I thought maybe this would finally be the thing that shifted his perspective. An upcoming marriage, the promise of eventual grandchildren, some evidence that I was finally getting my life together in ways he could recognize and approve of. I had practiced introducing Marcus, rehearsed talking about our plans, even bought a new dress that looked more conservative than my usual style. But from the moment we walked into the house, I could feel the familiar weight of his disappointment settling over me like a heavy coat. His handshake with Marcus was perfunctory, his questions about Marcus's work as a music teacher polite, but clearly unimpressed. When Jessica mentioned that Robert had just been promoted to regional manager, my father beamed with pride and launched into a 10-minute monologue about expansion plans and profit margins. When I mentioned that my latest client had praised my work and referred me to 3 new businesses, he nodded once and changed the subject to the weather. Dinner started normally enough. We said grace. Something about being thankful for family and blessings and abundance. My father carved the turkey with the same methodical precision he applied to everything else. My mother fluttered around the table, refilling water glasses and asking if anyone needed more stuffing, her nervous energy a familiar soundtrack to family gatherings. Jessica and Robert talked about their kids' school programs and soccer tournaments. Marcus tried valiantly to find common ground, asking questions about the business, complimenting the house, making the kind of small talk that greases the wheels of family obligation. But I could see it building in my father's face. That familiar tightness around his eyes when he was preparing to deliver one of his lectures. The way his jaw set when he was about to explain, once again, how the world really worked, and how I had failed to understand it. I had seen that expression countless times before, usually followed by some variation of his favorite themes. Responsibility, practical choices, the importance of building something lasting instead of chasing artistic fantasies. What I didn't expect was for him to turn his attention to Marcus. My father had a gift for finding exactly the pressure point that would cause the most damage, and apparently he had been studying my fiance all evening, looking for the perfect place to apply force. "So, Marcus," he said, sawing through his turkey with mechanical precision, "Sarah tells me you teach music at the elementary school." "That's right," Marcus replied, his voice warm and genuine. "4th and 5th grade. It's incredibly rewarding work. The kids are just starting to discover what they're passionate about, and music gives them a way to express themselves that sometimes they can't find anywhere else." My father nodded slowly, the way he nodded when a customer was explaining why they needed a part that didn't exist. "And what's the long-term plan there? You can't make much money teaching kids to bang on tambourines." I felt my stomach drop. Marcus handled it gracefully, explaining about his summer work with the community theater, his plans to pursue a master's degree in music education, his hope to eventually become a principal or district coordinator. But I could see my father's expression growing more skeptical with each word. In his mind, teaching was barely a step above unemployment, and arts education was essentially elaborate babysitting for the children of parents who couldn't afford real childcare. "Well," my father said finally, cutting his turkey into smaller and smaller pieces, "I suppose every community needs someone to keep the kids busy while the real adults are working." The table went quiet. Marcus's smile faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly, making some joke about the importance of keeping those future engineers and business leaders creative. My mother jumped in with a question about the elementary school's holiday concert, trying to steer the conversation away from the edge of the cliff we were all suddenly standing on. But my father wasn't finished. He had found his target, and now he was going to squeeze. "The thing is," he continued, still focused on his systematic destruction of his dinner, "a man has to think about more than just what makes him happy. He has to think about providing for a family, building security, creating something that will last. Teaching is fine for women. They have that nurturing instinct, and they usually have husbands to handle the real financial responsibility. But for a man," he shrugged, as if the inadequacy was self-evident. Marcus's face flushed slightly, but he kept his voice steady. I understand your concern, Mr. Bennett, and you're right that financial stability is important. But I think there are different ways to measure success. I love what I do, and I'm good at it. And I think that counts for something too. Love. My father repeated the word like it tasted bad. That's exactly the problem. Your generation thinks love and passion are enough to build a life on. But real life isn't a Disney movie. Real life is bills and mortgages and college tuition and medical emergencies. Real life is having something solid to fall back on when all that romantic nonsense fails to pay the rent. I felt heat rising in my chest. This wasn't about Marcus. Not really. This was about me. This was my father's way of telling me once again that my choices were foolish, that my values were wrong, that my entire approach to life was fundamentally flawed. He was using my fiance as a mirror to reflect my own inadequacies back at me. Dad, I said quietly, trying to keep my voice level. Maybe we could talk about something else. He looked at me then, and I saw something in his eyes that I had seen too many times before. Not just disappointment, not just frustration. Something colder. Something that looked almost like disgust. No, Sarah. I think this is exactly what we should be talking about. Because you're about to marry someone who teaches finger painting for a living, and I think you should understand what that means for your future. What that means for any children you might have. Jessica shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Robert was staring at his plate like it might provide escape. My mother's hands were twisted together in her lap, and I could see her silently pleading with me not to make this worse. But it was already worse. It had been worse for years, and I had just been pretending it wasn't. What exactly are you saying, Dad? I asked. He set down his fork and looked directly at me. I'm saying that you've spent your entire adult life making impractical choices, and now you're about to make the biggest impractical choice of all. Marrying someone who can't provide for you, who doesn't understand what it means to build something real, who thinks playing songs with children is somehow equivalent to running a business or contributing to society in any meaningful way. Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but my father held up a hand. I'm not finished. You want to know what I think? I think you're attracted to failure. I think you seek out people and situations that confirm your belief that life should be easy, that success should just happen naturally if you follow your bliss, or whatever nonsense they taught you in art school. But that's not how the world works. That's not how successful families work. And frankly, watching you repeat the same mistakes over and over again for the past 15 years has been exhausting. The words landed like physical blows. I felt my face burning, felt tears threatening at the corners of my eyes. Across the table, Marcus looked like he had been slapped. Jessica was staring at her father with an expression I couldn't quite read. Part shock, part embarrassment, part something that might have been recognition. William, my mother said softly. That's enough. No, Eleanor. It's not enough. Because somebody needs to tell her the truth. Somebody needs to explain to her why her life is falling apart. Why she can't seem to build anything stable or lasting. Why she's 32 years old and still living like a college student. I felt something crack open inside my chest. All the years of trying to please him. All the careful explanations of my work. All the attempts to prove that my choices were valid and worthy. It had all been wasted effort. He didn't just disapprove of my life. He was disgusted by it. He was disgusted by me. My life isn't falling apart, I said, and my voice sounded strange and distant in my own ears. Isn't it? You're barely making ends meet doing freelance work that could disappear tomorrow. You're about to marry someone who makes less money than some of my part-time employees. You have no savings, no real career prospects, no plan for the future beyond hoping that everything will somehow work out. If that's not falling apart, I don't know what is. The room was absolutely silent, except for the steady tick of the grandfather clock and the soft hum of Christmas music still playing in the background. I could feel everyone's eyes on me, waiting to see what I would do, how I would respond to this systematic dismantling of my entire adult life. And that's when he said it. The words that would echo in my mind for months afterward. The sentence that finally broke something that had been bending for years. You are the worst mistake I've ever made. The The words hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. I felt them settle into my bones, felt them try to take root in all the places where I had planted seeds of self-doubt over the years. For a moment, I just sat there, absorbing the impact, feeling the full weight of his rejection settle over me like a shroud. But then something else happened, something I hadn't expected. Instead of crumbling, instead of dissolving into tears or excuses or desperate attempts at reconciliation, I felt something harden inside me, a kind of crystalline clarity that cut through years of confusion and self-blame and desperate striving for approval that would never come. I looked at this man who had given me life, but had spent 32 years trying to reshape it into something he found acceptable. I looked at his perfectly pressed shirt, his carefully combed hair, his spotless reputation in a community that saw him as successful and respectable and worthy of admiration. I looked at the way my mother had gone completely still, the way Jessica was staring at her lap, the way Marcus was struggling to process what he had just witnessed. And I realized that I was done. Not angry, not yet, but finished, completed, like a book that had reached its natural end. I stood up slowly, my movements deliberate and calm. The chair scraped against the floor, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the heavy silence. I picked up my napkin, wiped my mouth with careful precision, and set it down beside my plate. "You know what, Dad?" I said, my voice steady and clear. "I need to thank you." He blinked, clearly not expecting this response. "Thank me?" "Yes, because for 32 years I've been trying to figure out what was wrong with me. Why I couldn't seem to make you proud. Why nothing I accomplished ever seemed to matter to you. Why I always felt like I was failing some test I didn't understand." I took a breath, feeling the words organize themselves in my mind with perfect clarity. But sitting here right now, listening to you call me the worst mistake you've ever made, I finally understand. It wasn't me. It was never me. It was you. His face darkened. "Sarah." "No, let me finish. Because this is important. This is probably the most important thing I'll ever say to you." I looked around the table, making eye contact with each person present. My mother, who had spent decades trying to keep peace by enabling his cruelty. Jessica, who had earned his approval by becoming exactly what he wanted, never questioning what that cost her. Robert, who had married into this family and learned to navigate it by staying silent. Marcus, who was getting his first real glimpse into the dynamics that had shaped me. "You called me the worst mistake you ever made," I continued. "But here's what I know about my life. I wake up every morning excited about the work I do. I create things that bring joy to people. I've built relationships with clients who trust me, who value what I bring to their businesses. I'm about to marry a man who teaches children to find their voices, who helps them discover beauty and expression and confidence they never knew they had. I live in a community of artists and creators, and people who believe that making the world more beautiful is just as valuable as making it more efficient." My father's jaw was set, his eyes cold, but he didn't interrupt. "I don't make as much money as Robert. I don't have a traditional career path. I don't fit into your definition of success. And you know what? I'm grateful for that. Because your definition of success has made you into someone who can look at his own daughter and call her the worst mistake he's ever made. Your definition of success has made you into someone who measures human worth in quarterly profits and practical outcomes. Your definition of success has made you small and bitter and cruel." My mother's eyes filled with tears. Jessica was staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "So thank you, Dad. Thank you for showing me exactly who I don't want to become. Thank you for demonstrating what happens when you care more about other people's opinions than your own children's happiness. Thank you for teaching me that love without acceptance isn't really love at all. It's just manipulation dressed up in family obligation." I reached for my purse, my movements still calm and deliberate. "I'm leaving now, and I won't be back. Not for holidays, not for birthdays, not for funerals. Because I'm done pretending that this is a family. Families support each other. Families celebrate each other's differences. Families create safe spaces where people can be themselves without fear of judgment or rejection." I turned to Marcus, who was watching me with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Ready to go?" He nodded, standing quickly, his chair scraping against the floor. As we moved toward the door, my father's voice followed us. If you walk out that door, don't expect to come crawling back when your little fantasy life falls apart. I paused at the threshold, my hand on the doorknob, and turned back to look at him one last time. Dad, I said softly, the only fantasy here is the one where you're a good father. I'm done participating in it. And then we left. We walked out into the cold December air, got into Marcus's car, and drove away from the house where I had learned to doubt myself, where I had been trained to measure my worth by someone else's impossible standards. The drive back to our apartment was quiet at first. Marcus reached over and took my hand, squeezing gently. I'm proud of you, he said finally. That took incredible courage. I laughed, but it came out shaky. I don't feel courageous. I feel like I just burned down everything I've known for 32 years. Sometimes, he said, that's what courage looks like. We spent that night talking about what had happened, processing the weight of what I had said and done, trying to understand what came next. Marcus held me while I cried, not for the loss of my father's approval, but for the years I had spent chasing something that was never real, never available, never offered in good faith. The next few days were strange. I felt untethered, like a balloon that had been released into the sky. There was grief, yes, but there was also an unexpected lightness. For the first time in my adult life, I didn't have to worry about disappointing my father. I had already done the worst possible thing in his estimation. I had rejected his authority, his values, his entire worldview. There was nowhere left to fall. My phone buzzed constantly with messages. My mother, pleading for reconciliation. Jessica, asking me to reconsider, to think about the family. Even Robert, sending a brief text saying he understood why I had done what I did, but hoping I might find a way to forgive. I didn't respond to any of them. Not because I was angry, but because I needed time to figure out who I was when I wasn't performing for an audience that would never be satisfied. The first few weeks were the hardest. There were moments when I doubted myself, when I wondered if I had overreacted, when I felt the pull of old patterns trying to reassert themselves. But then I would remember the look on my father's face, when he called me his worst mistake, and I would know that I had made the right choice. Christmas came and went without any contact from my family. New Year's Eve found Marcus and me at a party in our downtown neighborhood, surrounded by artists and musicians and teachers and writers, people who measured success in creativity and connection, rather than profit margins and quarterly reports. At midnight, as fireworks lit up the sky outside the warehouse windows, I felt something I had never experienced before during a holiday season. Peace. The real test came in the spring, when my mother called to tell me that my father was in the hospital. Nothing life-threatening. A minor surgery that had been complicated by his high blood pressure and stress. She was crying as she explained that he was asking for me, that he wanted to see me. I listened to her voice break as she described how difficult the past few months had been, how quiet the house was, how much he missed me despite his inability to say so. And I felt nothing. Not anger, not satisfaction, not even sympathy. Just a calm recognition that his emotional needs were no longer my responsibility. I hope he recovers quickly, I told her, but I won't be coming to visit. Sarah, please. He's your father. No, Mom. A father is someone who builds you up, who celebrates your achievements, who loves you unconditionally. What he's been to me is a critic, a judge, a source of constant disappointment. The fact that we share DNA doesn't obligate me to subject myself to more of that. She cried then, long and hard, and I felt sorry for her. But I didn't change my mind. Summer brought unexpected news. Jessica called, the first time we had spoken since Christmas, to tell me that she and Robert were getting divorced. She was sobbing as she explained that she had finally admitted to herself that she had never really loved him, that she had married him because he fit the image of what their father wanted for her, that she had spent her entire marriage performing a role instead of living a life. I keep thinking about what you said at Christmas, she whispered, about families creating safe spaces, about love without acceptance not really being love. I realized that I've never felt safe to be myself, even in my own marriage. We met for coffee the following week. She looked different, thinner, older, but somehow more present than I had ever seen her. She told me about the therapy she had started, about the writing class she had enrolled in, about the small apartment she had rented downtown where she could figure out who she was when she wasn't being the perfect daughter or the perfect wife. "I used to think you were weak," she admitted. "All those years of struggling financially, not having a traditional career, not settling down the way you were supposed to. But you were actually the strong one. You were the only one brave enough to be yourself." We talked for 3 hours that day. Really talked. Maybe for the first time in our adult lives. She asked about my work, about Marcus, about our plans for the future. And I found myself sharing things I had never been able to share with my family. My hopes, my fears, my dreams that had nothing to do with their expectations. By the time autumn arrived, my life had settled into a new rhythm. My business was thriving. Word-of-mouth referrals from satisfied clients had kept me busier than I had ever been. Marcus had been accepted into a graduate program that would allow him to continue teaching while working toward his master's degree. We had started looking at houses, talking about marriage plans, building a future that was entirely our own. I heard updates about my father through Jessica, who still maintained minimal contact with our parents. He had retired from active management of the business, though he still went to the office most days. He had sold 2 of the smaller stores and was talking about selling the rest. My mother had started volunteering at the local animal shelter, something she had always wanted to do, but had never felt free to pursue. "Do you ever miss it?" Jessica asked during one of our regular coffee dates. "The family dinners, the traditions, the sense of belonging to something?" I considered the question carefully. "I miss the idea of it," I said finally. "I miss what I thought it could be, but I don't miss the reality of it. I don't miss walking on eggshells, trying to guess what version of myself would be acceptable on any given day. I don't miss the constant feeling that I was failing some test I couldn't understand." She nodded. "I know what you mean. Sometimes I feel guilty for being relieved that I don't have to perform anymore. Guilt is just leftover programming," I told her. "It takes time to uninstall it." The first anniversary of our Christmas confrontation came and went quietly. Marcus and I spent the day skiing with friends, then came home to our warm apartment and made dinner together while music played softly in the background. No tension, no performance, no careful navigation of emotional landmines. Just the simple pleasure of being with someone who loved me exactly as I was. That night, as we lay in bed talking about the year that had passed, Marcus asked if I had any regrets. About standing up to him? No. About the way I said it? Sometimes. About the timing? Maybe. But about finally telling the truth? Never. He was quiet for a moment. "Do you think you'll ever talk to him again?" I had thought about this question many times over the past year. Part of me imagined a future reconciliation, a moment when he would finally understand what he had put me through and offer a genuine apology. Part of me fantasized about him showing up at my door, humbled and ready to accept me as I was, rather than demanding that I conform to his expectations. But mostly, I had come to understand that those scenarios were just another form of seeking his approval. They required him to change, to grow, to become someone he had never shown any interest in becoming, and I was no longer willing to hold my peace hostage to his emotional development. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "Maybe someday. If he ever becomes capable of loving someone without trying to control them. If he ever learns to apologize without conditions or qualifications. If he ever understands that being a father means more than just providing financial support and moral lectures. And if he doesn't, then I'll be okay without him. I'll be more than okay. I'll be free." 2 years later, my phone rang on a Tuesday afternoon while I was working on a website design for a local bakery. It was my mother, her voice smaller and more fragile than I remembered. "Your father wants to talk to you," she said without preamble. I saved my work and leaned back in my chair. "What does he want to say?" I think he wants to apologize." I felt something shift in my chest. Not hope exactly, but curiosity. "For what specifically?" She was quiet for a long moment. "For calling you his worst mistake. For the things he said about Marcus. For for not being the father you needed him to be. I stared out my window at the street below, watching people go about their ordinary lives, walking dogs, carrying groceries, living without the weight of family dysfunction dragging behind them like an anchor. "Mom," I said gently, "does he understand why I haven't spoken to him in 2 years?" "I think so. Yes. He's been different, quieter. He asks about you sometimes. He saw an article about your work in the business journal, and he kept it on his desk for weeks. This surprised me. My work had been featured in a local publication showcasing young entrepreneurs, but I hadn't thought anyone in my family would see it or care. What did he say about it? Nothing, really, but he read it multiple times, and he asked me questions about what you do. Real questions, like he was trying to understand. I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. Not because I was ready to forgive, but because I was grieving again. For all the years when his understanding could have made a difference, when his curiosity could have built bridges instead of walls. "I'm not ready," I told her. "Maybe someday, but not yet." She sighed, a sound that carried decades of disappointment. "He's getting older, Sarah. We both are. I don't know how much time we have left to fix this." "Mom, his age doesn't create an obligation for me to accept an apology I'm not ready to receive. And my timeline for healing doesn't have to match his timeline for making amends." After we hung up, I sat in my office for a long time, staring at the half-finished website on my screen. The bakery owner had commissioned me to design something warm and inviting, something that would make people feel welcome and valued. It struck me that I had spent my entire adult life learning to create spaces that felt safer than the one I had grown up in. Marcus found me there an hour later, still staring at the screen. "Everything okay?" he asked, settling into the chair across from my desk. I told him about the call, about my father's apparent desire to apologize, about my mother's gentle pressure to reconcile before it was too late. "How do you feel about it?" he asked. Confused, skeptical, sad, a little angry that he thinks he can just decide when we're ready to have a relationship again. Marcus nodded. "What would it look like for you to feel ready?" It was a good question, one I had never really considered in concrete terms. I think I'd need to see evidence that he's genuinely changed, not just that he feels guilty. I'd need to know that he understands what he did wrong, why it was wrong, and how he plans to be different going forward. I'd need to believe that he's capable of loving me without trying to fix me. And how would you know that? I don't know. Maybe if he could have a conversation with me where he didn't offer advice or criticism or suggestions for how I could improve my life. Maybe if he could ask questions about my work without implying that it's not real work. Maybe if he could meet Marcus as a human being instead of as a symbol of my poor judgment. We talked for another hour about boundaries and forgiveness, and the difference between reconciliation and capitulation. Marcus had his own complicated family history, his own understanding of how difficult it could be to separate love from control, acceptance from approval. That night, I called Jessica to tell her about our mother's call. "He's been different," she confirmed. "Quieter, like Mom said. More reflective, I guess. He asks about you sometimes, but not in the demanding way he used to. More like he's trying to understand something he's never understood before." "Do you think he's really changed? Or do you think he's just older and more aware of his own mortality?" Jessica was quiet for a moment. "Maybe both? I mean, does it matter what motivates someone to grow, as long as they actually grow? I think it does matter. If he's only reaching out because he's afraid of dying with regrets, then it's still about his needs, not about genuine care for me. If he's only apologizing because Mom is pressuring him to repair the relationship, then it's still manipulation. Just softer manipulation." "That's fair," she said. "But what if he's genuinely realized that he was wrong? What if he's actually capable of being different now? Then he'll understand why I need time to believe that. He'll be patient while I figure out whether it's safe to trust him again. He won't pressure me or guilt me or set deadlines for my forgiveness." 6 months passed without any direct contact from my father. My mother called occasionally with updates. He was doing well, he was reading more. He had started going to therapy after Jessica suggested it. But he didn't push for a meeting, didn't send messages through other family members, didn't show up at my apartment or my workplace demanding an audience. This patience, more than anything else, made me think that maybe something had actually shifted. The breakthrough came in an unexpected way. I was at the farmer's market on a Saturday morning, buying vegetables for the week, when I saw him at a booth selling honey and maple syrup. He looked older, more fragile than I remembered, his hair completely gray now, his shoulders slightly stooped. He was talking to the vendor about different types of honey, asking questions with genuine curiosity, rather than his usual authoritative pronouncements. For a moment, I considered turning around and walking away, but something made me stay, made me watch him from across the aisle as he carefully selected a small jar of wildflower honey and counted out exact change. There was something different about his demeanor, gentler, more present, less performative. When he turned to leave, our eyes met across the crowd. He stopped, his face cycling through surprise, hope, uncertainty. He raised his hand in a small wave, and I found myself waving back. We stood there for a moment, separated by 20 feet of market chaos, looking at each other like strangers trying to remember how they knew each other. Then he walked over, moving slowly, carefully, like someone approaching a wild animal that might bolt. "Sarah," he said when he reached me, "you look well." "Thank you, so do you." We stood there awkwardly, the sounds of the market flowing around us, vendors calling out prices, children laughing, dogs barking. Normal Saturday morning sounds from a world that had continued spinning despite our family drama. "I heard about your business doing well," he said finally. "The article in the journal. I was proud." The words hit me unexpectedly. I had imagined this conversation so many times over the past 2 years, but I had never imagined it starting with pride rather than apology. "Thank you," I said again, because I didn't know what else to say. "I know you probably don't want to talk to me," he continued, his voice quiet and uncertain, "but I wonder if, maybe sometime, you might be willing to have coffee. Just to talk. No agenda, no expectations. Just talk." I studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation, for the familiar expectation that I would immediately forgive and forget and return to playing my role in his family narrative. But what I saw instead was genuine uncertainty, real vulnerability, the kind of openness I had never seen from him before. "Maybe," I said. "Let me think about it." He nodded quickly. "Of course. Take all the time you need. I just wanted you to know that I've been thinking. A lot. About things I said, things I did, things I didn't do." A woman with a stroller bumped into us, apologizing as she maneuvered around our conversation. The interruption seemed to break whatever spell had been holding us in place. "I should go," I said, holding up my bag of vegetables like evidence of other obligations. "Yes, of course, but Sarah—" He paused, searching for words. "I know I don't have the right to ask for anything from you, but if you ever decide you're willing to try, I'd like to listen. Really listen. For the first time in my life." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, and walked away. My hands were shaking as I loaded my groceries into the car, and I sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes trying to process what had just happened. The man I had just spoken to seemed genuinely different from the one who had called me his worst mistake 2 years earlier. Smaller, somehow. Less certain of his own righteousness. More aware of his own fallibility. But I had learned to be suspicious of my own hope, especially when it came to my father. How many times had I convinced myself that he was changing, that he was finally ready to see me as I really was, only to be disappointed when he reverted to his familiar patterns of criticism and control. I called Marcus from the car. "I just ran into my dad at the farmer's market," I said without preamble. "How do you feel?" It was such a perfectly Marcus question. Not what happened or what he said, but how did it feel to be in his presence again? "Confused," I said. He seemed different, smaller, more human. He asked if we could have coffee sometime, and he said he wanted to listen for the first time in his life. "What did you tell him?" "That I'd think about it." "And are you? Thinking about it?" I watched other shoppers loading their cars with flowers and fresh bread and locally grown tomatoes. Normal people living normal lives, dealing with normal family relationships that probably involved disappointment and frustration, but maybe not the kind of fundamental rejection I had experienced. "Yes," I said finally. "I'm thinking about it." 3 weeks later, I sent my father a text message. "Coffee tomorrow at 2 p.m., the Blue Door Cafe on Main Street." He replied within minutes. "I'll be there. Thank you." I spent the night before our meeting lying awake, running through possible scenarios, trying to prepare myself for disappointment, while remaining open to the possibility of genuine change. Marcus held my hand in the dark and reminded me that I could leave at any time, that I didn't owe my father anything, that his emotional needs were not my responsibility. "But what if he really has changed?" I whispered into the darkness. "Then that would be wonderful. But you don't have to sacrifice your peace to find out. You can take this as slowly as you need to." I arrived at the cafe 5 minutes early and chose a table near the window where I could see the street. My father arrived exactly on time, wearing a simple sweater instead of his usual pressed shirt and tie. He looked around the cafe with curious eyes, taking in the mismatched furniture and local artwork, the kind of place I was sure he would have dismissed as unprofessional 2 years earlier. "Thank you for coming," he said, as he sat down across from me. We ordered coffee, black for him, a lavender latte for me, and sat in awkward silence for a moment. I had promised myself I wouldn't make this easy for him, wouldn't smooth over the uncomfortable moments the way I had spent years doing. "I'm not sure where to start," he admitted finally. "How about with why you wanted to have this conversation?" He stirred his coffee slowly, though he hadn't added anything to it. "I've been going to therapy. Did your mother tell you?" She mentioned it. "I've been learning about the difference between being right and being loving, about the difference between wanting what's best for someone and actually knowing what's best for someone." He looked up at me briefly, then back down at his coffee. "I've been learning that I confused those things for a very long time." This was not what I had expected him to say. I had prepared for defensive justifications, for explanations of his behavior that placed the blame elsewhere, for apologies that came with conditions and expectations. "What else have you been learning?" I asked. "That calling your daughter the worst mistake you ever made is not something you can take back. That it doesn't matter what you meant to say or what you were feeling in the moment. That words like that leave marks that don't heal just because time passes." He looked up at me then, and I saw tears in his eyes. "I've been learning that I spent so much time trying to prepare you for a world that I thought would be harsh and unforgiving, that I became harsh and unforgiving myself. I thought I was protecting you by pushing you to be practical, to make safe choices, to build the kind of life that couldn't be taken away. But what I was really doing was taking away your right to choose your own life." I felt my own eyes fill with tears, but I blinked them back. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I'm 68 years old, and I'm tired of being proud and stubborn and right about things that don't matter. Because I've watched you build a life that brings you joy, and I've realized that joy is worth more than security. Because I spent 2 years missing you, and thinking about all the times I could have said I was proud, instead of pointing out what you were doing wrong." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I read this article about your business. It talked about how you help small businesses tell their stories, how you design websites that reflect their values and personality. There was a quote from one of your clients about how you helped her understand what made her bakery special, how you translated her passion for baking into something that attracted exactly the right customers." He unfolded the paper carefully, smoothing it on the table between us. "I realized that's what I never did for you. I never asked what made you special. I never tried to understand your passion. I just kept trying to convince you to be someone else." I stared at the article, printed from the online version and carefully folded, obviously read multiple times. My father had kept this, had studied it, had tried to understand who I was through the words of strangers. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I know that saying sorry doesn't undo 30 years of criticism and disappointment and trying to make you into someone you were never supposed to be. But I wanted you to know that I see you now. Really see you. And I am so deeply, genuinely proud of who you've become." The tears I had been holding back spilled over then. Not because his words magically healed everything, but because they acknowledged the reality of what had been broken between us. He wasn't minimizing the damage or asking me to pretend it hadn't happened. He was simply taking responsibility for his part in it. "I don't know if I can trust you again," I said through my tears. "I understand. I wouldn't trust me either, if I were you. I don't know if I can let you back into my life without being afraid that you'll go back to judging everything I do. I understand that too." We sat there crying together in the middle of a busy cafe. Two people who shared DNA and history, and decades of accumulated hurt, trying to figure out if there was a way forward that didn't require either of us to sacrifice who we had become. "What would it look like," I asked finally, "if we tried to have some kind of relationship? What would you want from me?" He considered this question seriously, wiping his eyes with his napkin. "I'd want to know about your work. Not so I can give advice or suggestions, but because I want to understand what you love about it. I'd want to meet Marcus properly, as the man you've chosen to build a life with, not as someone I need to approve of. I'd want to learn how to be supportive without trying to fix things that aren't broken. And what would you need from me? Patience, I guess, and honesty when I slip back into old patterns, because I probably will sometimes. This is new for me, learning how to love without controlling. I thought about this for a long moment, imagining what it might feel like to have a father who asked questions instead of giving lectures, who celebrated my choices instead of questioning them, who saw my differences as strengths rather than problems to be solved. "I think," I said slowly, "we could try, but it would have to be slow. And you'd have to be okay with the fact that I might need to step back if it starts feeling unsafe again." He nodded quickly. "Whatever you need. Whatever timeline works for you." We talked for another hour, carefully mapping out what a tentative relationship might look like. He would come to my next art show, if I was comfortable with that. I would consider bringing Marcus to a family dinner, sometime in the future when we had rebuilt enough trust. We would start with occasional coffee dates like this one, conversations where we practiced talking to each other as adults rather than as disappointed parent and defensive child. When we finally said goodbye outside the cafe, he surprised me by asking if he could hug me. It was the first time I could remember him asking permission for physical affection, rather than simply assuming it was his right as my father. The hug was awkward at first. We had both forgotten how to be physically close without emotional armor. But then his arms tightened slightly, and I felt something I hadn't felt since childhood. Safety. The sense that he was holding me not because he was supposed to, but because he wanted to. "Thank you," he whispered into my hair. "Thank you for giving me a chance to try again." That conversation was the beginning of a slow, careful process of rebuilding something that had been broken for so long we had both forgotten what it was supposed to look like. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't always comfortable. There were moments when he slipped back into old patterns of advice-giving and criticism, moments when I had to remind him that his opinion hadn't been requested. There were sessions where I had to leave early, because the conversation had triggered too many old wounds, too many memories of feeling small and wrong and inadequate. But there were also moments of genuine connection. The afternoon he came to my studio and spent 2 hours asking thoughtful questions about my design process, genuinely curious about how I translated a client's vision into visual reality. The evening when Marcus cooked dinner for all of us, and my father spent the entire meal listening to stories about Marcus's students, laughing at their antics, asking follow-up questions that showed real interest rather than polite tolerance. The moment that convinced me he was truly changing came 6 months after our coffee shop reconciliation. I had been commissioned to design a website for a nonprofit that provided art therapy for children with disabilities. It was exactly the kind of work my father had always dismissed as impractical do-gooder nonsense. The kind of project that didn't pay well, but fed my soul in ways that purely commercial work never could. I mentioned the project during one of our monthly dinners, bracing myself for his inevitable questions about the financial viability or practical impact. Instead, he leaned forward with genuine interest and asked if I could show him some of the artwork the children had created. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through photos the organization had shared. Finger paintings by kids who couldn't hold traditional brushes, collages created by children who communicated through images rather than words, sculptures built by hands that shook with neurological conditions but still managed to create beauty. My father studied each image carefully, asking questions about the techniques, the therapeutic benefits, the way art provided these children with forms of expression that traditional communication couldn't offer. "This is important work," he said finally, and his voice carried a reverence I had never heard from him before. "This is the kind of work that changes lives in ways that can't be measured in quarterly reports." I stared at him. This man who had spent my entire childhood and young adulthood measuring everything in terms of profit and practical utility, acknowledging that some things were valuable precisely because they couldn't be quantified. "I'm proud of you," he continued, meeting my eyes directly. "Not because this project will be good for your business, not because it demonstrates some skill I can understand, but because you chose to use your talents to help children who need exactly what you have to offer. That's the kind of choice that makes the world better." That night, I called Jessica to tell her about the conversation. "He really has changed," she said, and I could hear the wonder in her voice. Not completely, not perfectly, but genuinely. It's like watching someone learn a new language, except the language is love without conditions. "Do you think it's permanent?" I asked. "Or do you think he'll revert back to his old patterns once the novelty wears off?" "I think change is a daily choice," she said. "And I think he's choosing differently now because he finally understands what the old way cost him. The question is whether you can trust him to keep making that choice." It was a fair question, one I continued to grapple with as our relationship slowly rebuilt itself into something neither of us had experienced before. Trust, I was learning, wasn't a switch that could be flipped back to the on position. It was something that had to be earned gradually, through consistent actions and words that aligned over time. The real test came a year later, when Marcus and I announced our engagement. I had been dreading this moment, knowing that weddings tend to bring out people's strongest opinions about tradition, appropriateness, and the proper way to celebrate love and commitment. My father's response surprised me. Instead of offering unsolicited advice about venues or guest lists or financial planning, he asked a single question: "How can I support you in creating the kind of wedding you want to have?" It was such a simple question, but it represented a fundamental shift in how he approached my choices. Instead of assuming he knew what was best for me, he was asking what I wanted and offering to help me achieve it. The wedding planning process became an opportunity for our healing relationship to deepen. He offered to contribute financially without attaching conditions about how the money should be spent. He listened when I explained why we wanted a small, informal ceremony instead of a traditional church wedding. He met Marcus's parents with genuine warmth and curiosity, rather than the territorial defensiveness I had expected. Most importantly, when I asked him to walk me down the aisle, he understood that it wasn't a symbolic transfer of ownership from father to husband, but a father's public acknowledgement of his daughter's choice to build a life with the person she loved. On the morning of my wedding, he knocked on the door of the cottage where I was getting ready with my bridesmaids. When I opened it, he stood there holding a small wrapped box and looking more nervous than I had ever seen him. "I have something for you," he said. "It was your grandmother's. I've been saving it for when I thought you'd found the right person to share your life with." Inside the box was a simple gold locket, delicate and worn smooth by years of wear. I opened it to find a tiny photograph on one side, my grandmother as a young woman, laughing at something outside the frame, and an inscription on the other side that read, "Love without limits." No, she used to tell me that love without limits was the greatest gift anyone could give or receive, my father said, his voice thick with emotion. I didn't understand what she meant for most of my life. I thought love meant protecting people from making mistakes, guiding them toward safe choices, ensuring they built lives that couldn't fall apart. But she meant love that doesn't try to control or change or improve the other person. Love that celebrates who they are, rather than who they could become, if they just tried harder. He reached out and fastened the locket around my neck, his fingers gentle against my skin. "I should have given you love without limits from the beginning," he said. "I should have celebrated your artistic spirit instead of trying to make it more practical. I should have trusted your judgment instead of questioning every choice you made. I should have seen your differences as gifts instead of problems to be solved." I felt tears threatening my carefully applied makeup, but I didn't care. "You're giving it to me now," I said. "That's what matters. I know it doesn't undo the years when I gave you criticism instead of support, when I measured your worth by my standards instead of recognizing your own. But from this day forward, you have my love without limits. Whatever choices you make, whatever paths you choose, whatever challenges you face, you have my support, my pride, and my unconditional love." We stood there in the doorway, father and daughter, both of us crying, both of us grateful for second chances and new beginnings. The wedding was exactly what Marcus and I had dreamed of: small, intimate, filled with people who genuinely celebrated our love rather than performing social obligations. My father's toast was simple and heartfelt, welcoming Marcus to the family and expressing his gratitude for the joy I had found. But the moment that meant the most to me came during the father-daughter dance. As we swayed to the music, he leaned close and whispered, "I am so proud of the woman you've become. Not because you finally did what I wanted you to do, but because you never stopped being who you were meant to be." 2 years have passed since that conversation at Christmas dinner, when my father called me the worst mistake he had ever made. 2 years since I stood up and told him exactly what I thought of his definition of success, his version of love, his approach to being a parent. Looking back now, I can see that moment as the turning point not just for our relationship, but for my entire understanding of what family could be. Not a group of people bound by obligation and tradition and shared DNA, but a chosen community of individuals who celebrate each other's authentic selves. My father will never be the parent I needed during my childhood and young adulthood. Those years are gone, and the wounds they left have healed into scars that will always be part of my story. But he has become something I never thought was possible. A parent who loves without limits, who supports without controlling, who takes pride in my choices rather than trying to reshape them. The business I built from nothing continues to thrive. The man I married continues to teach children to find their voices through music. The family we're building together is grounded in acceptance and respect, and the radical idea that love means celebrating someone exactly as they are. And sometimes, when I'm designing a website for a struggling artist, or helping a small business owner tell their story, or working on a project that feeds my soul but doesn't pay well, I think about that Christmas dinner when everything fell apart. I think about the moment I finally said what I had been holding back for 32 years. The moment I chose my own worth over someone else's approval. I think about how sometimes the worst thing that can happen to a relationship is exactly what needs to happen for a real relationship to begin. My father was wrong about a lot of things. He was wrong about what makes a life worth living. Wrong about how to measure success. Wrong about what kinds of work have value in the world. But he was especially wrong when he called me the worst mistake he had ever made. Because the truth is, I'm not a mistake at all. I'm exactly who I was meant to be. And it took standing up to him, walking away from his approval, and building a life entirely on my own terms for both of us to finally understand that. Tell me in the comments if you've ever had to choose between your peace and someone else's expectations. What gave you the courage to choose yourself? Where are you listening from, and what does family mean to you now? Because sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone, even someone who has hurt you, is the truth about who you really are. The snow is falling again outside my window as I finish writing this. Soft, forgiving snow that covers everything equally, without judgment, without conditions. The kind of snow that makes the whole world look clean and possible and new. Just like love without limits. Just like second chances. Just like the family we build when we finally learn the difference between being accepted and being loved.